Hello, my name is Suzanne Dreesen, and I am a food safety extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. In February of 2017, I did a presentation for the local foods college, and that was sponsored by the University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnership. And so I'm going to re-record that presentation to provide some updates on the Minnesota Cottage Food Producer Law. This training will qualify for you to become Tier 1 registered as a Minnesota Cottage Food Producer. So that is for selling less than $5,000 of cottage food products per year. In this presentation, we'll take a look at the Cottage Food Law. We'll look at what's allowed and what's not allowed under the Cottage Food Law, what foods you can and cannot sell under the Cottage Food Law. We'll look at how much you can make and sell under the Cottage Food Law, where your products can be sold, where they cannot be sold, and signage that's required at the point of selling your products. And then we'll look at labeling requirements and registration process and the training requirements as well. Let's start with an overview of the Minnesota Cottage Food Law. This is my cottage in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I'm not currently a cottage food producer, but if I were, I would want to make sure that I'm doing everything legally and safely so that I can keep my cottage. The Cottage Food Law became effective and was signed into law on July 1st, 2015. It revoked any previous cottage food and pickle bill language that was in law, so this replaced everything that was in statute previously, and it's actually a food licensing exemption. So you're exempted from having to secure and pay for a food license. And this statute is governed by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and it is part of 28A.152 in the Minnesota statute. So who is a cottage food producer? It is an individual, no businesses of any kind, no organizations, no LLCs, and you would prepare non-potentially hazardous food without inspection or a license, and you manufacture that food, and it has to be food that does not require time or temperature control for food safety. So it does not need to be kept cold or hot to control microbial growth. Usually that food is made in a private home or residence, but there's nothing in the law that prohibits you from using a commercial kitchen. And you would sell that product directly to the end consumer, and you need to register with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. You're registering, you'll get a registration card. It's not a license, however, and you can sell up to $18,000 per year per individual. That is gross sales, and we register per calendar year, so the registration is good from January 1st through December 31st. And you can make up to $18,000 per year per individual. So if you have a household of 4 and each of you are registered, you could make up to $72,000 total. As a cottage food producer, you are only allowed to make and sell foods that are non-potentially hazardous. So those are foods that do not support microbial growth. So you're controlling for the acidity level or the water activity level. And for those of you that are doing canning of acidified foods like pickles or salsa, or you're doing fermentation, you're going to control for the acidity level. So non-potentially hazardous food would have acidity levels measured by pH of less than or equal to 4.6. And for those of you that are baking or drying or making jams and jellies, you're going to control for water activity or the moisture level in the product, and so that moisture level or water activity would be less than or equal to 0.85. So potentially hazardous foods are those foods that are capable of supporting the rapid and progressive growth of infectious or toxigenic microorganisms, and they would have a acidity level or pH of greater than 4.6, and they would also have a high water activity as well too, of greater than 0.85. So things like a stuffed meat pie or meat pastry, cooked rice, steamed green beans, or cooked meatloaf, any cooked products that have high protein foods like meat, fish, poultry, those would not be allowed under the cottage food exemption. So the Minnesota Farmers Market Association online has a list of non-potentially hazardous foods. On this list you'll have foods that are allowed under the cottage food exemption, as well as foods that are not allowed under the cottage food exemption and would need a food license to do those products that are not allowed. So you can find this list on mfma.org, so go online to check this out. It does get updated periodically. It was recently updated. The last update was July 18th, 2017. But check this list out because it can give you some ideas of things you may not have thought of and want to try as a cottage food producer. So now we're going to go through that list of products that are allowed, and we'll talk about products that aren't allowed under each category as well. So let's take a look at home canned fruit. So things that would be allowed under the cottage food exemption would be those fruits that are naturally acidic, so they have acidity level measured by pH of less than or equal to 4.6. So home canned fruit needs to be processed in a canner, so they're usually in a jar, sealed, processed in a boiling water canner. You will find some processing times for pressure canners for pressure canning fruit as well too, so that would be okay. You would have to produce and sell those home canned fruit items in Minnesota, however, so they need to be produced and sold in Minnesota. You can get your peaches from somewhere else, but you have to make and process and sell home canned fruit in Minnesota. So some examples would be applesauce, cherries, fruit ciders, fruit juices, fruit pie fillings. When you're doing fruit pie fillings, make sure you're using a research tested recipe, and research tested recipes will call for a special starch that works in the canning process. So you cannot use flour or cornstarch to thicken your pie fillings, so making sure you're following recipes and directions exactly. Lime or lemon curd would also be allowed. Not allowed under this exemption would be if that fruit has an acidity level of greater than 4.6 measured by pH. So bananas, melons, figs, mangoes, they're all above 4.6. And any raw, uncanned, unpasteurized fresh fruit juice and ciders that require refrigeration would not be allowed under the cottage food exemption. So the next category is home canned pickled products. Things that would be allowed under the cottage food exemption would be products that you acidify, so you usually add vinegar to it. Those would have an acidity level pH of less than or equal to 4.6. Using a tested research recipe that has a date of 1994 or newer is recommended, because you're using the latest research tested recipes. And you want to use a tested recipe not only for safety but also for quality. You would have to process these in a jar and in a canner. Usually you're using a boiling water canner or pasteurization method for pickles. These products need to be produced and sold in Minnesota. So some examples that I see at markets are pickled asparagus, pickled beets, pickled carrots, pickled cantaloupe, pickled dilly beans, and then of course your cucumbers as well too. Not allowed under this exemption would it, if that acidity level is greater than 4.6, and also you would need a license to do pickled eggs, pickled fish, pickled meats, or pickled seafood. So those products would not be allowed under the cottage food exemption. Home canned vegetable products that you can make under the cottage food exemption would be products that have a final acidity level of less than or equal to 4.6. You want to use a tested research recipe. Great sources are online from the National Center for Home Food Preservation or University of Minnesota Extension website. If you do search for recipes online, make sure that it's referencing tested or university-based resources. You can also find tested recipes from the Ball Company, for example, preserving.com, and also Presto. They do their research and development and test their recipes and processes. Also, like your pectin or your Sure-Gel recipes that are included would be accepted as well, or research tested resources. You will process that product in a canner, depending on what you're doing. Salsas usually do in a water bath canner, but if you're doing some tomato products, those can be canned in a pressure canner or a water bath canner, depending on the directions. You will produce and sell those products in Minnesota. Some examples that I see at markets are tomato-based salsas, Minnesota tomato mixture. I don't see a lot of that, although I do hype that up because it's one of my favorite to can. It actually was developed by the University of Minnesota in the 1970s, and we had that recipe reevaluated by the National Center for Home Food Preservation in the late 1990s. We wanted to make sure that it was still safe, and it was found safe to do so, as long as that product's acidified. And you'll find that recipe on our University of Minnesota Extension website. Tomato juice, Bloody Mary mix are other examples that are popular. Not allowed under the cottage food exemption would be if that acidity level, that final product pH, is greater than 4.6. Any raw, uncanned, fresh juices, tomato juice would not be allowed unless it's canned. And you would need to get a license for any low acid foods, like if you wanted to do just plain corn or plain green beans, not acidify those products, those are low acid foods and you need a special process and a license to do that. Also meat, fish, soup, spaghetti sauces, if they add meat or even low acid products, if they meet that pH of greater than 4.6, they would not be allowed as a cottage food. Home canned condiments would have a final acidity level of less than or equal to 4.6. Again, using a tested recipe is safest and best. Process those in a canner, but you will find from the University of Wisconsin, search for University of Wisconsin hot filled hold process, because there are some research tested ways other than canning and boiling a water bath for some condiments. You process or produce and sell those products in Minnesota. Chutneys, horseradish, mustard, taco sauce are some popular home canned condiments that I see at markets in Minnesota. Things that would not be allowed under the cottage food exemption, again, if that final product had a pH of greater than 4.6. And you would need a license for, again, any low acid foods. So if you had a fruit-based chutney and you started adding nuts, nuts have a pH of greater than 4.6, it's going to change things. Also pesto with oil, that would not be allowed. It's very risky for Clostridium botulinum that causes botulism. Same thing with flavored oils. When you start adding herbs, garlic, there's a risk for Clostridium botulinum growth. And then mole paste as well too is low acid. So how do you know if your home canned salsa has reached a safe pH? Well, you need to test it. Test it with a pH meter. Purchase a pH meter. They're fairly reasonable to purchase, usually around $50. And you want to make sure that you're testing each batch and test that 24 hours after processing. So after it's canned and sealed for 24 hours, it does need to reach that equilibrium pH of less than or equal to 4.6 in that 24 hours after you processed it. If you want to learn more about how to use a pH meter or what to purchase, University of Wisconsin has a great handout. Just search on the internet for purchasing and using a pH meter by the University of Wisconsin. So how do you select a recipe if you're doing any food preservation methods like canning, pickling, drying, or jams and jellies? So what you want to look for is a research or science-based tested recipe. The source should be 1994 or newer, and great sources are university research tested recipes or ones that reference university or USDA. Recipes from equipment, ingredient manufacturers are also considered reliable as well. If you have an heirloom recipe, great-great-grandma's best pickles ever, what you want to do is take that recipe and compare it to a current research-tested recipe. And what you will look for is, first, if it's a pickle recipe, you're going to look for the vinegar to brine ratio. So usually it's 1:1, 1 part vinegar to 1 part water. In great-great-grandma's days, the vinegar was stronger. It was about 10% acidic acid, and now we're at 5% acidic acid, so that's why we have a 1:1 ratio. In most recipes, not all. And then you also want to compare it for the processing time. How long do you process it in that boiling water canner? And then also with any canning recipe, look at the jar size too. If the recipe only calls for pint jars, you can't put that product into quart jars because you wouldn't get the heat transfer and the enough time in that quart jar to kill off the pathogens. My favorite site is the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and that site has all kinds of research tested recipes. If you go on the left column, you'll see how do I can, freeze, dry, pickle, make jams and jellies. And if you click on one of those, all the recipes related to that process will pop up, so check that out. Another great resource is the So Easy to Preserve book by the University of Georgia. And what's nice about that reference is that it has, again, all the processes, but it's only $18 to order, so that's a great deal. Let's move on to baked goods. Things that would be allowed under the cottage food exemption would be things that do not require refrigeration for safety. So for an example, you may make cream cheese mints because they have a lot of sugar in it and tie up that water activity, but they're safe at room temperature, but you may want to refrigerate those, especially in the summer, so they don't melt, but you're doing that for quality and not for safety. Baked products can be baked, sold within and across Minnesota borders. Some examples are bars, biscuits, biscottis, bread, fresh or frozen bread, the loaf, but not frozen dough would not be allowed. Cake, cookies, donuts, pies if they're fruit filled. Not allowed if they have a water activity of greater than 0.85 or a pH greater than 4.6. Cake, brownies, bread baked in jars are not allowed, therefore have a risk of Clostridium botulinum. And a license would be required for those frozen bread doughs or cookie doughs, custard filling, banana cream, or pumpkin pies, cheesecakes. Those are not allowed under the cottage food law. The ones that you'll see in the store, if you see them on the shelf, they've been acidified. Non-baked dairy items or non-baked products containing raw eggs would not be allowed. Meat pies or final products garnished with cut fresh fruit or vegetables, focaccia topped with pepperoni, and raw sliced tomatoes would be an example. Those would not be allowed. So there are products that can cross state lines as far as cottage food products. And again, those are like your baked goods, dried products, fermented foods. But one thing that you just have to keep in mind is you need to comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act, and that's the preventive controls for human food rule. You would be exempted from having to do a food safety plan, but you would need to register your cottage food production facility with the FDA, and you can find more information. So search for what you need to know about the FDA regulation, current good manufacturing practices, preventive controls guidance for the industry, small entity compliance guide. So check that out for more information. In the classes I teach, we have people bring in product and we test their product for pH and water activity and/or water activity. So we tested a banana bread someone brought in, and it had a water activity of 0.92 and a pH of 7.2. So this would not be allowed cottage food product, right? Because those parameters kick it into a potentially hazardous food product. They tested just plain cream cheese. That's pretty borderline, 0.84 for water activity, but it is less than 0.85. Then this person made her own raspberry filling that she uses for cakes, and that tested out at 0.97. So the water activity was high, but because of the raspberries, the pH was fine at 3.0. So it did qualify as a non-potentially hazardous food. And then she did a raspberry buttercream frosting, and that was a water activity of 0.82, so that was fine. And then a vanilla buttercream was 0.80. So again, it's do your homework about your ingredients and do some research on what those final products test out as far as water activity and acidity levels. So do you need to get your product tested to verify its non-potentially hazardous food status? Well, if you use a tested canning recipe for those salsas, pickles, you do not have to have that final product tested by a lab, but make sure that you're following the recipe exactly, and then have that retain that recipe and sources documentation. If you're using a non-standard recipe, you must have that product tested. So if you're making up your own salsa recipe, or a recipe that's adding a lot of frosting, that's adding a lot of butter or milk that you're just making up, you'll want to get that tested. For frostings, you test for water activity. For salsas, you would test for the pH. So again, testing for pH, it has to be less than 4.6 to qualify as a cottage food, or the water activity has to be less than or equal to 0.85. And then again, you'd submit those copy of results to MDA. You can email it to mda.cottagefood@state.mn.us. But 95% of your baked goods would not need to have product testing. But again, if you're starting to add a lot of more moisture foods or low acid foods to that product, that's when you'd want to get that food product tested. So you actually get that final food product tested, not the recipe, but the final product that you make, and you'd send that in or drop it off depending on what lab you're using. But a couple of labs that cottage food producers have been using our Minnesota Valley Testing Lab out of New Ulm, and then our Tech Labs out of Arden Hills, Minnesota. And you'll see here that their product testing is fairly reasonable. pH test you can get around $15, water activity around $30. The ETHO is alcohol content, and that is about $100, and that is for people that are fermenting, like kombucha, which is a fermented tea, or kefir sodas, which actually do produce alcohol to control for microbial growth. Let's take a look at those sweet goods, candy and confections. Allowed, that final product cannot require refrigeration for food safety. Those products can be made and sold within or beyond Minnesota borders. Examples would be carameled apples, chocolate covered nuts, dried fruits, pretzels, cream cheese mints, fudge, popcorn balls are some examples. Not allowed if that final product water activity is greater than 0.85 or the pH is greater than 4.6. Products containing raw eggs would not be allowed. A license would be required for any cream-based fillings. They have a high moisture content. Meat, fish, or seafood, poultry fillings. I'm not sure you'd put those in candy or confections, but I don't know. And then any chocolate covered fresh berries or fresh melon, fresh pineapple. Some people want to do those edible bouquets. Those would require a food license to do so. Dry, dehydrated, and roasted products. Those products can be made, sold within and beyond Minnesota borders. Some examples are baking or dry soup mixes, some dried beans, lentils, kidney beans I've seen, coffee beans, people are roasting those, some dried teas, dried fruit or vegetable leathers or chips, granola, cereals, trail mixes, herbs and herb blends, pasta, egg noodles, popcorn, any seeds, pumpkins, sunflowers. And then not allowed, again, if that water activity is greater than 0.85 or the pH is greater than 4.6. And a license would be required for roasting vegetables. Jerky, meat, fish, poultry, and seafood jerky would not be allowed under this exemption, or nut butters. They do require refrigeration for safety. Icings, frostings, or sugar art. Again, they will have a water activity of less than or equal to 0.85. If you're doing icings or frostings, you want to check out the Come and Bake It book by Texas. There was a woman from Texas that is a cottage food producer, and she had 24 recipes tested. Some buttercream with milk and cream cheese in it and butter. So Minnesota Department of Agriculture has accepted these as research and approved tested recipes. So if you're using those, you'll be good, as long as they've met the non-potentially hazardous standards or parameters, because some recipes in that book were deemed potentially hazardous. Those products can be made and sold with and beyond Minnesota borders. Examples would be royal icing made with meringue powder. A lot of royal icings call for raw egg whites. The raw egg whites would not be allowed. Buttercream frostings, if they're deemed non-potentially hazardous. And fondant, glaze, and cake toppers would be allowed. Not allowed if that water activity is greater than 0.85 or the pH is greater than 4.6. Uncooked items with dairy wouldn't be allowed, or uncooked items containing raw eggs. And the uncooked items with dairy, again, unless they've been deemed non-potentially hazardous, so using a resource or having that product tested by a lab, then they would be allowed. Fermented products, things that would be allowed, again, you're controlling for acidity, so the pH would be less than or equal to 4.6. Fermented products can be made and sold within and beyond Minnesota borders. Examples are kimchi, pickles, sauerkraut, non-alcoholic kombucha, or non-alcoholic kefir sodas. The acidity level, if it's over 4.6, it would not be allowed. And fermented products that require refrigeration for food safety would not be allowed. And for those products that produce alcohol, that final product with an alcohol content of over 0.85 would not be allowed. That kicks them into an alcohol alcoholic product, and that is controlled or regulated by the Department of Safety. On our University of Minnesota Extension Food Safety page, we do have a cottage food resource hub. So we have a lot of resources and links to recommended resources to help you grow your business or find those research tested recipes or recommended resources. So if you have any questions about cottage food products, things that you can or can't do, I encourage you to contact the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and they have an email address. So you can email them, or you can call their cottage food or farmer market phone line at 651-201-6081. So where can you sell your cottage food products? Again, you have to sell directly to that end consumer. You can sell from your cottage or your home if your zoning allows you to do that. In where I live in St. Cloud, I can have a cottage food or home-based business in my house, but I am not allowed to have people come pick up their products, so I would have to deliver the product to them. You can deliver the product. You can sell your product over the internet, collect money, but you have to deliver that product, or they have to pick it up. So you can't ship that product to that consumer or use any delivery services. You can sell at farmers markets and then at a community event, and local jurisdictions can define what a community event is. And usually a community event is open to the public, and the proceeds go back for the community good. As of August 1st, 2017, cottage food products can now be donated to fundraisers. So you can donate your products to charities or other organizations for fundraising events, but you do need to follow all provisions under the Cottage Food Law, and including labeling. So all the labeling information needs to be there, and then you also have to have the signage that says these products are homemade and not subject to state inspection. You cannot sell your cottage food product to a grocery store or a cafe, a restaurant, or any retail setting as a wholesale product. So you can sell it to them for them to resell it. And also, you are not allowed to donate your cottage food product to like a food pantry or a food shelf either. The only exception now is that you can donate your product to a charity. So if they're doing a silent auction, for example, you could donate that product. At the point of sale, you do need to have this statement or signage that says these canned goods are homemade and not subject to state inspection. You do not have to put this on your food label though, but you do need to have it at the point of sale. So that's for canned goods. And if you're doing any other products, then you use this statement: these products are homemade and not subject to state inspection. Now, these disclaimers do need to be also posted on your website or internet site or Facebook page if you're advertising or selling your product online. If you are interested in having an on-site inspection by the health department of your cottage food facility, so your home or where you're doing cottage food production, you can request that. But remember, it's not required. You do not have to be licensed or have an inspection done. But some people choose to do that. They may charge you a fee, but you'd work with your local authorities or health department to do that. Local jurisdictions can also pass zoning ordinances or restrictions as well too. So you need to know your zoning ordinances related to having a home business. And then they also can enforce a local definition of a community event as well too. So if you're not sure if something qualifies as a community event, so to sell your cottage food products, you can check with your local authorities. Our next topic will be on labeling. 28A.152 Cottage Food Exemption Subdivision 1A 1.1. The prepared food offered for sale under this clause has to be labeled to accurately reflect the name and address of the person preparing and selling the food. So we want to know what address that food was prepared at, and making sure that you're putting the street address and the city and zip as well too. No P.O. boxes are allowed. You have to put the date produced, and I am not seeing this on products I'm picking up. So making sure you put that date produced has to be on your label, and then you have to include ingredients, all ingredients, and then any possible allergens as well. When you make your ingredient list, you are going to put what you used most in that product, what ingredient you used most in that product, and you're going to put that first, and what you use least is going to go last. So in this recipe, tomato mixture recipe, what we would put first would be the tomatoes, and then we put the celery, green pepper, followed by onion, and then you also have to put the what you're using for the acidifier as well too. So in this recipe they use citric acid. So you'll see on the citric acid ingredient that there is sub-ingredients. So basically what you need to do is making sure that you are copying over this ingredient onto your label. So just copy it right over just like that. So you put citric acid, and then in parentheses you'd put less than 2% silicone dioxide, and then anti-caking. You have to put the function of that ingredient. You also have to declare the big 8 allergens. These are the 8 allergens that are responsible for 90% of the allergic reactions in the United States. So you have to, in plain language, declare if you use peanuts, tree nuts, so almonds, hazelnuts, Brazil nuts, cashews, chestnuts, coconut, hickory nuts, macadamia nuts, pine nuts, pistachios, or walnuts, and you actually name the nut that you use. Fish or shellfish, those are not allowed ingredients in cottage foods, but making sure that you're checking the ingredients, the label on the ingredients that you use. Because if you're using, let's say, Worcestershire sauce in your Bloody Mary mix, for example, know that most of those contain either sardines or anchovies, which is a fish. So you have to declare that. And then milk, egg, soy, and wheat are the other allergens that you would have to declare on your label. So here's an example of a label. So you want to name your product, so name it clearly. So if it has chocolate chip cookies with walnuts, so people know what's in there. There's optional stuff that you can put, like made with love here, but you can also put optional things too. Let's say you're making that Bloody Mary mix or salsa, you might want to put refrigerate after opening on the label. But required are your name, so the name of the cottage food producer, where that product was made with the full address and location, and then your ingredients. And you'll see here that you put the ingredients and then followed by the name ingredients with all the ingredients listed. And you'll see how they did the sub ingredients there with the vanilla. So they put the vanilla, and then everything that was on that vanilla label was transferred over here in parentheses. And then they have a contain statement: wheat, eggs, milk, and walnuts. So whether you're a Tier 1 or Tier 2 cottage food producer, there's some training requirements, and you need to complete the training before you register as a cottage food producer. So for Tier 1, those are sales less than $5,000 per calendar year per individual. You can complete a registration training course such as this one, or Minnesota Department of Agriculture has one on their website as well. If it's a Tier 2, which are sales over $5,000 to $18,000 per calendar year per individual, then you need to complete a safe food handling course not to exceed 8 hours. And that training for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 is required every three years. Minnesota Department of Agriculture has the Tier 1 training, and basically it's a PowerPoint that you read through. There is an exam at the end, and then we also have the University of Minnesota Extension. We offer Tier 1 classes and also Tier 2 advanced classes, and you can search our website for Cottage Foods, extension.umn. And also we are currently working on an online course too, so that should be ready by the end of 2017. Let's take a look at registration requirements. You need to register with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture before you start selling your cottage foods, and annually thereafter. Registration is on a calendar year from January 1st to December 31st. If you're a registered cottage food producer, in late November, you will receive a mailing from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and they will give you a code that you can go online to renew your registration. There is a $50 fee if you fall into that Tier 2 category of making more than $5,000, and this is based on last year's sales. And if you're less than $5,000, then there's no registration fee. The application form, again, you can find on the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and it's a one-page form. Here, by signing, you're saying that you took the required training, and that you have checked with zoning that it's okay for you to have a cottage food operation out of your residence. After you send in your application to become a Minnesota Cottage Food registered producer, you will receive a registration card from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and it'll take about 2 to 3 weeks for them to process it if you're using your Social Security number on your application. If you used a tax ID number on your application, it'll take about 5 to 6 weeks, because they have to verify your tax ID number with the Secretary of State. So this registration card will come with your name, and you do need to display this registration card at point of sale, or at least have it with you. This is a map of current cottage food producers, registered cottage food producers in Minnesota. You'll see they're all over the place. In 2017, it's growing. We have 2,025 cottage food producers. This is as of June 2017. Another website that you'll want to check out is our frequently asked question blog. As we get questions and I get answers to those questions, I will update this blog, so it's a good place to check out any updates. So this presentation did qualify as Tier 1 training to become a Tier 1 cottage food producer. There is an exam that you do need to take before you register, however. So contact me, you can email me, and I will send you that exam. My email is Driesen, DRIESSEN @umn.edu, or you can call me at 320-203-6057 if you need me to send that to you in the mail. Take that exam. It's just a check for knowledge. You don't need to send it back to me to have me correct it. The answers are actually on the back, and you do not need to send a copy of that with you when you send in your application either. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck in your cottage food operation.